Before we begin, let me ask you something. What would you do if someone offered you $2 million to walk away from the person you loved? Most people say they would refuse. Most people have never watched the only person who ever cared about them die on a hospital bed while the clock ran out. This is not a love story. Not yet. This is the story of a woman who was forced to choose between love and life, and a billionaire who spent 6 years hating her for a sacrifice she made to save someone he never even knew existed. And it all unraveled because of a birthmark on a 6-year-old girl's neck. The iron hissed against damp fabric, sending a thin ribbon of steam curling toward the cracked ceiling. Hadley Sutton pressed the nose of the thrift store iron along the velvet nap of a child's dress, coaxing out wrinkles that had settled during 3 years, folded inside a Goodwill bag. The dress was burgundy once. Now it had faded to something closer to dried roses, but it was clean and the stitching held, and that was enough. Rain hammered the single window of their attic apartment in Far Rockaway, that narrow strip of Queens where the subway didn't bother running on time, and the landlords didn't bother fixing the radiators. Hadley had stuffed towels along the windowsill to catch the leak. She'd learned years ago that complaining only reminded Mr. Delvatio she existed, and existing meant he might remember to raise the rent. Now pause here for a moment. Far Rockaway. If you've never been there, it is one of the most isolated neighborhoods in New York City. It takes nearly 2 hours by subway to reach Manhattan. The median income in parts of that area barely crosses $30,000. This is where Hadley Sutton raised her daughter alone for 6 years. Remember that, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why every detail of this poverty matters. Mama, Lily sat cross-legged on the pull-out sofa that doubled as their bed. A sheet of construction paper balanced on her knees. She was drawing again, always drawing. This time a building with hundreds of windows and a chandelier visible through the front door. Each crystal rendered with the obsessive detail only a 6-year-old with too much imagination and too little experience could produce. Mama, tonight at the fancy hotel, do you think my daddy will be there to hear me sing? Hadley's hands stopped mid-stroke. The iron sat motionless on the velvet, and she could smell the fabric beginning to scorch, but she couldn't move. 6 years of practice had not made this question easier. It arrived in different shapes. At breakfast, at bedtime, once in the middle of a grocery store, when Lily spotted a man carrying his daughter on his shoulders. But it always landed in the same place, a fist closing around Hadley's windpipe. She set the iron upright, knelt beside the sofa, tucked a strand of dark auburn curl behind Lily's ear. Daddy lives very far away, baby, but I promise you, wherever he is, he'd be so proud of you tonight. Lily considered this with the grave solemnity children reserve for information they suspect is incomplete. Then she returned to her drawing, adding a tiny figure in a red dress standing at the center of the chandelier building, mouth open in song. There is something that psychologists call ambiguous loss. It is the grief that comes from losing someone who is still alive. A parent in prison, a father who simply vanished. For a child like Lily, her father was not dead. He was not gone in any way she could understand. He was just absent. And absence when you're 6 years old is the loudest thing in the world. Hadley watched her daughter's small hand move across the paper and felt the familiar ache settle behind her sternum. Not sharp anymore, not the way it had been in those first months, but deep like a bone that had healed crooked and now only hurt when the weather changed. She picked up the dress again. The scorch mark was barely visible against the faded velvet. She'd work with it. She always did. 20 minutes before they needed to leave, Hadley performed the ritual she'd repeated every morning since Lily started preschool. She opened the wooden box on the bathroom shelf, the only object she'd kept from her former life, though she didn't call it that. Come here, sweetheart. Let's put on your special bow. Lily tilted her chin up, exposing the soft hollow of her throat. There, just below the left side of her jaw, sat a birthmark the color of dark wine, a crescent moon cradling a small, perfect star. It was beautiful, actually, in the way that unusual things are beautiful to the people who love them. But Hadley had learned in Lily's first year of daycare that children are not people who love unusual things. Children are predators with juice boxes. Freak witch mark. What's wrong with your neck? Are you sick? The cruelty had been casual the way children's cruelty always is, which made it worse. Lily had come home silent, her fingers pressed against her throat as though trying to push the mark beneath her skin. After that, the ribbon became routine. Hadley would tie it into a neat bow, and Lily would touch it with her fingertips and smile because her mother had told her it was her signature accessory, her trademark, the thing that made her Lily Sutton and nobody else. And because Lily was 6, and because she trusted her mother completely, she believed it. Now this detail, the ribbon, might seem small. A mother protecting her daughter from schoolyard cruelty, but I want you to hold on to this moment because that ribbon was covering more than a birthmark. It was covering the single piece of evidence that would connect this 6-year-old girl to one of the wealthiest families in America. And Hadley had no idea. She was hiding a treasure map and didn't even know the treasure existed. "Remember," Hadley said, straightening the bow, "no matter what, we keep the bow on. Deal." "Deal." Lily stuck out her pinky. They shook on it. Hadley had no idea, could not possibly have known that this small protective lie was a lit fuse. The Langham Hotel rose above Fifth Avenue like a cathedral of money, its limestone facade scrubbed white and its brass doors polished to mirrors. The winter gala for the Kensington Children's Foundation drew the kind of crowd that arrived in motorcades. Hedge fund patriarchs, media heiresses, a former Secretary of State who still carried herself like she might run again. The ballroom occupied the entire 7th floor, and through its arched windows, Manhattan glittered like a circuit board left on overnight. Let me give you some context on what kind of event this is. The Kensington Children's Foundation Gala. In real life, events like these charge anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 per table. The guest list is curated like an art collection. Every handshake is a transaction. Every smile is an investment. This is the world that Hadley once touched and was violently expelled from. And now she's re-entering it through the service entrance. Wearing a borrowed employee badge, Hadley entered through the service entrance on 51st Street, holding Lily's hand with one hand and her employee badge with the other. The children's choir director, Mrs. Huang, a Taiwanese woman with a voice like a tugboat horn and a heart the size of the Chrysler Building, had pulled strings to get Hadley backstage access. "Stay with the other children until your number," Mrs. Huang instructed the choir, then pulled Hadley aside. Hadley nodded. She had no intention of wandering anywhere. She'd spent 6 years building an invisible life, and invisible was exactly how she intended to stay. In the ballroom above, a different kind of performance was underway. Julian Prescott stood on the VIP mezzanine, one hand curled around a glass of Chateau Margaux. He had no intention of drinking, the other buried in the pocket of a Tom Ford suit that cost more than Hadley's annual rent. He was 34 years old, the sole heir to the Prescott Financial Group, and according to Forbes, the 11th wealthiest person under 40 in the United States. According to his therapist, the third one this year, he was also profoundly, catastrophically lonely. Though he would never have used that word, he preferred efficient. Relationships were inefficient, emotions were overhead. Love was a depreciating asset he'd written off 6 years ago. Beside him, Blair Kensington adjusted the high collar of her emerald Valentino gown and touched his arm with the proprietary confidence of a woman who had already mentally redecorated his penthouse. "Darling, grandfather wants to make the announcement before the choir performance. The press is ready." The announcement, their engagement, a merger dressed in Cartier diamonds, connecting the Prescott banking dynasty to the Kensington media empire. Julian had agreed to it the way he agreed to most things now, with a shrug and a signature, because saying yes required less energy than explaining why nothing mattered. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't see behind the emerald collar that rose to her jawline, was the reason Blair wore high necklines to every public event. It was not a fashion choice. It was camouflage because Blair Kensington did not have the birthmark. Now we need to talk about Arthur Kensington because this man is the key to understanding everything that comes next. Arthur Kensington was 91 years old and still terrifying. He sat in a wingback chair near the stage, his gold-handled cane propped against the armrest, his eyes scanning the room with the unblinking patience of a man who had outlived 3 wives, 2 financial crises, and every enemy foolish enough to underestimate him. The cane was decorative. Arthur could walk perfectly fine. He simply enjoyed the theater of appearing frail while his mind operated at full voltage. He had built the Kensington Empire from a single New England newspaper into a media conglomerate spanning 4 continents. He had buried a son, Blair's supposed father, dead of an aneurysm at 42, and placed all his remaining hope in the granddaughter who carried his name. Or so he believed. The birthmark was a family legend, the kind of thing old money clung to the way churches clung to relics. Every direct blood Kensington for 5 generations had been born with it. A crescent moon and star, wine dark at the base of the throat. Arthur's wife Eleanor had it. His son had it. It was, in Arthur's words, God's signature on the Kensington Charter. Old money families often have these kinds of markers. Biological heirlooms they treat as proof of lineage. In some European royal families, certain physical traits were tracked across centuries. The Habsburg jaw, the Bourbon nose. For the Kensingtons, it was this birthmark. And in a world where money can buy almost anything, including new identities, forged documents, the birthmark was the one thing that could not be faked. The engagement announcement was made with the mechanical grandeur of a corporate press release. Arthur spoke briefly, his voice still carrying the gravel authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Julian stood beside Blair, his expression pleasant and vacant, the human equivalent of a screensaver. Cameras flashed. Applause rippled. Julian shook hands he wouldn't remember. And then the lights dimmed for the children's choir. Mrs. Huang had arranged the 12 children in a semicircle at center stage. They were scrubbed and nervous and luminous in the way that only children performing for an audience of strangers can be. Lily stood near the middle, her burgundy dress catching the stage light, the black ribbon, a neat punctuation mark, at her throat. The choir opened with a standard arrangement, something safe and seasonal. Julian turned away, reaching for his wine glass. He'd endured the announcement. He'd done his duty. The helicopter was on standby at the East River helipad. Huang gestured, and the choir parted, and Lily stepped forward alone. No accompaniment, no microphone, just a 6-year-old girl and a song that had no business being in a children's repertoire. An old New England lullaby, the kind passed down by women who worked fishing docks and rocked cradles in the same callous hands. The melody was simple and ancient and devastating. Lily's voice lifted into the ballroom like smoke from a candle. Julian's hand never reached the glass. He knew this song. He knew it the way you know the smell of your childhood bedroom, the way you know the sound of a door closing for the last time. 6 years ago, in a studio apartment in Brooklyn during a blackout, a woman with auburn hair had sung this exact melody to ease the migraine splitting his skull in half. She'd pressed his head against her chest, and the vibration of her voice had traveled through his bones. And for the only time in his adult life, Julian Prescott had felt safe. Music is the most powerful memory trigger the human brain possesses. Neuroscience has proven that a melody can bypass every rational defense and deliver you straight to the emotional core of a memory. Julian had spent 6 years building a wall between himself and everything he felt for Hadley. And a 6-year-old girl demolished it in 8 bars of an old lullaby. He turned slowly, as though moving too quickly might shatter something. He stepped to the edge of the mezzanine rail. His eyes found the small figure on the stage, the dark curls, the serious expression, the way she held her hands clasped in front of her, exactly the way Hadley used to when she was concentrating. And then Lily stumbled. It was nothing, a half step too close to the platform edge, a child's momentary loss of balance. She caught herself instantly, didn't miss a note. But the stumble jarred the tortoiseshell clip holding the ribbon at her nape, and the silk slipped free, sliding down her shoulder like a dark whisper. The spotlight was merciless and perfect. It illuminated every detail of the girl's exposed throat, the pale skin, the delicate collarbones, and there, unmistakable under 10,000 watts of theatrical light, the crescent moon cradling its star, the color of old wine. Julian's fingers spasmed. The stem of the Margot snapped. Red wine spilled across the white marble rail and dripped onto the carpet below, like something bleeding. He didn't feel the broken glass cut his hand. He was staring at the birthmark. He was staring at the eyes, gray, the color of winter storms over the Atlantic. His mother's eyes. His eyes set in a face shaped exactly like a photograph of himself at age 5 that hung in the Prescott Estate Library. Think about what's happening inside Julian's mind right now. In the span of approximately 10 seconds, His brain is processing three impossible pieces of information simultaneously. One, a child is singing the song only one person in his life ever sang to him. Two, that child has the Kensington birthmark that connects her to one of the most powerful families in the country. Three, the eyes, the curls, the small hands clasped exactly like Hadley's. Behind him, her smile had frozen. She'd seen the ribbon fall. She'd seen what was underneath. Julian, she said, her voice carrying a note he'd never heard before. Something between command and panic. Julian, we should go. The car is... He was already moving. He hit the mezzanine stairs two at a time, shouldering past a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes that exploded against the banister in a cascade of glass and bubbles. People turned. People stared. Julian Prescott, the man who moved through the world like cold water, controlled, contained, never a degree above necessary, was shoving through a crowd of 400 people like a man running from a fire or toward one. He reached the stage before Lily finished her song. He didn't use the stairs. He planted one hand on the stage edge and vaulted up, his Tom Ford jacket splitting at the shoulder seam, and dropped to one knee on the polished hardwood, his bleeding hand leaving a thin red print on the floor. Lily stopped singing. The ballroom went silent, not the polite silence of an audience between movements, but the shocked, collective intake of breath that precedes either a standing ovation or a catastrophe. Julian's face was level with the child's. Up close. What's your name? His voice cracked on the second word. He sounded nothing like a billionaire. He sounded like a man who'd been holding his breath for 6 years and had just remembered how lungs worked. Lily took one step back, her small hand. I'm Lily, she said softly. Lily Sutton. Oh God, he whispered. The words weren't for Lily. They weren't for the audience. They were for himself, for the version of himself that had spent 6 years hating the wrong person. Oh my God. From the wings, Hadley saw everything. She saw Julian kneeling. She saw Lily's hand on her throat. She saw the ribbon, her careful daily ritual, lying useless on the stage floor. And she understood with the clarity of absolute terror that the invisible life she'd built was over. She pressed both hands against her mouth to trap the sound, trying to escape. A sound that had no name, somewhere between a scream and a prayer. And then she turned and ran. And here we have two people experiencing the exact same moment from completely opposite emotional positions. Julian is experiencing revelation. Hadley is experiencing exposure. For him, this is the beginning of something. For her, it's the end. She has spent 6 years constructing anonymity the way other people construct careers. Every decision, where she lived, what she wore, the ribbon on her daughter's neck was a brick in a wall designed to keep this exact moment from happening. And in 3 seconds, a child's stumble reduced 6 years of architecture to rubble. Hadley, she was fast, faster than he remembered, sharpened by years of walking everywhere because the subway fare added up. But his legs were longer, and his desperation was louder than her fear. He reached her near the freight elevator, caught her wrist, and she spun to face him with such force that her back hit the tiled wall. They stood there, breathing hard. Two people who had once slept curled together in a bed barely wide enough for one, now separated by 6 years and $2 million. In a canyon of lies neither of them had dug alone. Let go of me! Her voice was low and steady, which impressed him even as it infuriated him, because his own voice was doing nothing of the kind. 6 years. He could barely get the words out. His hand was still bleeding. Red drops fell on the white tile between his shoes. You took my mother's money. You took my child. You let me believe. I let you believe what you already believed. Hadley's eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She had spent every tear she owned years ago, and there was nothing left for this man in his expensive outrage. The accusation landed because it was true. Julian's jaw worked. No sound came out. Yes. Hadley lifted her chin, and in the fluorescent light with her drugstore mascara and her secondhand dress and her fury, she looked more regal than anyone in the ballroom above. I'm exactly the kind of woman you people think I am. So do me a favor, Mr. Prescott. Go back to your champagne and your fiancé and your press cameras and leave the poor people alone. Notice what happened next. She wrenched her wrist free. She walked to the service exit, pushed through the door, and disappeared into the December rain, where Lily was already waiting with Mrs. Huang under a bodega awning half a block away. Julian stood in the corridor. The freight elevator hummed. The kitchen porter wheeled a cart past him without a second glance. Just another rich guy having a bad night. The cut on his palm throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He looked down at the blood on his hand and thought, if she took $2 million, why is she living in a dress that costs less than my dry cleaning? It was the first honest question he'd asked in 6 years. And that question, that one question, is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Because for 6 years, Julian accepted a simple story. Woman meets rich man, woman gets pregnant, rich man's mother pays woman to leave, woman takes the money and disappears. Case closed. But simple stories are almost always wrong. They exist to protect the people who tell them. And Julian is finally asking the question that demolishes his simple story. If she took the money, where did it go? The DNA results arrived at 6:47 the following evening. Julian read them standing at his office window, 52 floors above Midtown, while Manhattan turned on its lights below, like a city remembering it existed. 99.99% probability of paternity between Julian Prescott and Lily Sutton. He set the paper down, picked it up, read it again. The numbers didn't change. They were immutable and absolute, and they rearranged the architecture of his entire adult life with the quiet efficiency of a demolition charge. His phone rang. Daniel Voss, his chief forensic accountant, the man Julian trusted to find money the way bloodhounds find fugitives. I have the trace on the check. Tell me. The $2 million was never deposited into any account under Hadley Sutton's name. It was converted to a cashier's check the same day it was issued. The payee was the National Organ Transplant Foundation, flagged as an emergency payment for a cardiac transplant patient named Margaret Chen. Julian sat down. He hadn't planned to sit down, but his legs made the decision for him. Who is Margaret Chen? I pulled the Foster records. Margaret Chen was a custodial worker at Our Lady of Mercy Orphanage in the Bronx. She took in a baby girl, abandoned, no birth certificate, no family, and raised her as her own informally. Never had the money for legal adoption. The girl's name in the orphanage registry was Hadley. Hadley Jane Doe, later Hadley Sutton, when Chen gave her a surname for school enrollment. Chen was the only family she ever had. Julian closed his eyes. The story was assembling itself inside his skull, like broken glass fitting back into a window. The transplant, he said. Did it work? A pause. Daniel Voss was not a man who paused. The surgery was performed. Donor heart, emergency protocol. The body rejected the graft within 72 hours. Margaret Chen died on October 14th, 6 years ago, 3 days after the check was cashed. Now let that timeline sink in. Let me walk you through exactly what happened to Hadley Sutton in the span of 1 week 6 years ago. Day 1, Victoria Prescott, Julian's mother, intercepts her, tells her to take $2 million and disappear. Or Margaret Chen, the only mother Hadley has ever known, gets removed from the transplant list. Day 1, Hadley takes the money not for herself, for Margaret. Every cent goes directly to the Transplant Foundation. Day 4, the surgery happens. The body rejects the heart. Day 7, Margaret Chen dies. Hadley is now alone in the world. No money, no family, no partner. And sometime in those same days, she discovers she's pregnant. She is 22 years old. She has no income, no education, no support system, and a baby growing inside her. And she never goes back. She never calls Julian. She never begs. She disappears into Far Rockaway and raises that child alone for 6 years. This is not the profile of a gold digger. This is the profile of a woman who was blackmailed into making an impossible choice and then survived the consequences with a dignity that most people couldn't maintain for a week, let alone 6 years. Julian gripped the edge of his desk. The timeline was a knife, and it was cutting cleanly. Julian opened his desk drawer and took out the framed photograph he kept face down beneath a stack of quarterly reports. Hadley at 22 laughing, her hair wild with Brooklyn wind, taken on the roof of his first apartment before his mother found out, before the money, before all of it. She was looking directly at the camera, directly at him, and her expression held nothing. No calculation, no agenda, no performance. Just a woman in love with a man who wasn't worth it. And notice this detail. The photograph was face down, but it wasn't thrown away. It was hidden under quarterly reports, financial documents, the language of his new identity. He buried the evidence of his heart under the evidence of his wealth, but he kept it. For 6 years, he kept it. That tells you everything you need to know about what Julian Prescott was really feeling beneath all that efficiency. He turned the photograph face down again. Then he picked up his coat and walked out of the building. He drove himself. No driver, no security detail, no entourage, just a black Mercedes in the Long Island Expressway in a snowstorm that was trying its best to kill him. The wipers fought the accumulation. The headlights carved tunnels through the white. He deserved worse weather. Hadley's building was a 4-story walk-up on a block that smelled like salt water and fryer oil. The front door didn't lock properly. Someone had wedged a phone book into the gap. Julian climbed the stairs, cracked linoleum walls the color of old teeth, a radiator on the second-floor landing that clanked like a prisoner banging on pipes, and stopped outside apartment 4C. He could hear through the thin door the sound of a child humming. The same lullaby, the one from the gala, the one from the blackout. Lily was humming it, and beneath the humming, the soft rustle of pages turning, Hadley reading to her, probably the way she'd once read to Julian on Sunday mornings, her head in his lap, turning pages with one hand, while the other traced absent circles on his knee. He pressed his palm flat against the door. The wood was cold and warped, and it was the only thing separating him from everything he'd thrown away. He didn't bang, he didn't shout. He slid down until one knee touched the hallway floor, and he spoke into the gap between the door and the frame, his voice stripped of every defense he'd spent a decade constructing. Hadley, I know what happened with the money. I know about Margaret. I know everything, and I am so sorry. I am so goddamn sorry. The humming stopped. Please, I'm not here to take her. I'm not here with lawyers. I'm alone, and I'm asking. Just let me see you, both of you. Just once. Silence. Then the soft pad of feet on hardwood. A shadow darkened the gap beneath the door. Hadley was standing on the other side close enough that he could hear her breathing. She didn't open it. He stayed. The snow fell. The radiator clanked. Julian Prescott, who commanded boardrooms and terrified senators and moved markets with a phone call, knelt on a dirty hallway floor for 47 minutes until his knee went numb and his tears dried to salt tracks on his face. He didn't leave. He didn't demand. He just stayed. And that was the first right thing he'd done in 6 years. 47 minutes in a hallway that smelled like radiator fluid and old cooking grease. This is a man who flies by private helicopter, who has a personal driver on standby at all times. And he's on his knees on linoleum that hasn't been cleaned since the building was new. And he stays. He doesn't knock again. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't use the one tool he's relied on his entire adult life. Power, because he finally understands that power is exactly what destroyed this relationship. His mother used power. Blair used power. The entire system that separated him from Hadley ran on power. And so he does the one thing that power cannot do. He surrenders. He waits. She let him in 3 days later. Not because she'd forgiven him. Forgiveness was a country she couldn't see from where she stood. But because Lily had a fever of 103 and the nearest urgent care was 40 minutes by bus, and Julian's number had appeared on her phone with a text that read, I'm parked outside. I'll be here every night until you don't need me or until you do. He carried Lily down 4 flights of stairs wrapped in a blanket, and Hadley watched the way he held her daughter, careful, terrified, his hand cupping the back of Lily's head as though she were made of something irreplaceable, and felt the first crack in 6 years of cement. The doctor said it was just the flu. Julian sat in the waiting room for 3 hours reading a 2-year-old issue of Highlights magazine because it was the only thing on the table. When Lily woke up and saw him and asked with the uncomplicated directness of children, Are you my daddy? Julian looked at Hadley, and Hadley closed her eyes, and Julian said, Yes, sweetheart, I am, and I'm sorry I'm late. I'm sorry I'm late. 4 words, but they carry the weight of 6 years of absence. 6 years of a child asking, Where's my daddy? 6 years of a mother inventing answers to an impossible question. Julian doesn't say, I didn't know. He doesn't make excuses. He says, I'm sorry I'm late, which accepts responsibility without qualification. It's the first sentence he's spoken in this story that contains no defense mechanism. After that, he came every day. He didn't move them to a penthouse. He didn't send gifts. He showed up in jeans and a coat that probably cost more than the building's monthly utility bill. And he did whatever needed doing. He learned from YouTube, from Mrs. Huang, from an elderly Dominican woman on the third floor named Sonora Reyes, who appointed herself his instructor, how to braid Lily's hair. He failed spectacularly. He tried again. Lily laughed at the results, and the sound of her laughter did something to his central nervous system that no amount of money had ever achieved. He burned soup. He assembled a bookshelf from IKEA and had 4 screws left over. He fell asleep on the sofa one night while reading Lily a bedtime story and woke at 3 a.m. with a crick in his neck and a crayon drawing of a man in a blue car tucked into his hand. This is what real redemption looks like. Not grand gestures, not checks with a lot of zeros. Julian Prescott, who could buy Lily a library, is instead sitting on a sofa reading her a picture book until he falls asleep. He's burning soup on a stove that costs less than his belt. He's learning to braid hair from a woman in the building. And every single one of these small, unglamorous, imperfect acts is worth more than the entire Prescott fortune, because they cost something money can't buy. They cost his time, his vulnerability, and his willingness to be terrible at something in front of the people he loves. Hadley watched all of it. She said very little. She was, Julian realized, studying him the way she'd once studied art history textbooks, carefully, critically, looking for the flaw that would reveal the forgery. "You don't trust me," he said one evening after Lily was asleep. They were sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, a full cushion of distance between them. "No," Hadley said. She didn't elaborate. "I wouldn't either." "Good, but I'm not leaving that." She looked at him then, and for the first time the anger in her eyes shared space with something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the exhaustion that comes before it. The moment when holding the wall up costs more than letting it fall. "We'll see," she said. But the forces working against them were not done. Not even close. The news reached Blair Kensington through a network of informants. She maintained the way some people maintain gardens, constantly, obsessively pruning anything that threatened her preferred landscape. Julian had found the girl. Julian had found Hadley. Julian had traced the money. Blair sat in her dressing room at the Kensington estate in Greenwich, staring at her reflection while her assistant relayed the details. She watched her own face in the mirror, the way an actress watches dailies, checking for cracks in the performance. The performance had begun 26 years ago when Blair's mother, a woman named Irene Walsh, who had worked as a nursemaid to the Kensington family, made a substitution that would define 2 lives. The real Kensington granddaughter, the infant with the birthmark, was placed in an orphanage. Irene's own daughter was installed in the nursery. The swap was clean. Arthur never suspected. This is the kind of crime that doesn't look like a crime. No violence, no break-in, just a nursemaid swapping 2 babies while a grief-stricken old man was too devastated to notice the difference. But the consequences are staggering. One baby grew up in a mansion with private tutors and trust funds and a name that opened every door in America. The other baby grew up in an orphanage in the Bronx, was raised informally by a custodial worker, never had a birth certificate, and spent her 20s ironing thrift store dresses in a leaking attic apartment. 2 lives, 1 decision, 26 years of divergence. Blair had learned the truth at 16 when her mother, drunken maudlin, had confessed it in a fit of guilt that evaporated by morning. Blair had spent the next decade ensuring the secret stayed buried. Her mother stayed silent, and the real heiress stayed lost. She had almost succeeded, and then a 6-year-old girl with a birthmark walked onto a stage. Blair picked up her phone. She did not call a hitman or a kidnapper. Those were the tools of cheap fiction and cheaper villains. She called the Prescott family attorney, and then she called Victoria Prescott, Julian's mother. The weapon she chose was perfectly legal and infinitely more destructive. Within 48 hours, Hadley Sutton received a court summons. The filing sought emergency custody removal on grounds of financial incapacity, substandard living conditions, and suspected psychological manipulation of a minor for purposes of extortion. The legal team was the most expensive in Manhattan. The evidence was manufactured with the precision of a Swiss watch. This is the most terrifying weapon in a wealthy person's arsenal, and it is entirely legal. You don't need to threaten someone physically when you can threaten them legally. A custody suit filed by a billion-dollar legal team against a single mother with no resources is not a lawsuit. It is an execution with paperwork. Hadley read the summons at her kitchen table while Lily slept 10 feet away. Her hands shook so hard the paper rattled. In 6 years of poverty, of double shifts, and skipped meals and winters without heat, she had never cried. She cried now, silently, viciously, her face pressed into a dish towel so Lily wouldn't hear. They were going to take her daughter. Julian found out about the lawsuit at 11 p.m. when his personal attorney called with the voice people used to deliver diagnoses. He was on the road within 4 minutes, but he didn't drive to Hadley's apartment. He drove to Greenwich, to the Prescott estate, to the walnut-paneled study where his mother Victoria sat reading the Financial Times in a silk robe, her reading glasses perched on her patrician nose as though she hadn't just detonated a bomb in a woman's life. Julian placed the medical file on his mother's desk. Margaret Chen's records, the transplant, the rejection, the death certificate. You gave her $2 million, he said, and she spent every cent trying to save the only person who ever loved her. And then that person died anyway. And then she found out she was carrying my child. And she raised that child alone in poverty for 6 years while you told me she was a whore who took our money and ran. Hear me clearly. He planted both hands on the desk. Anyone who threatens Hadley or Lily, anyone is my enemy. I don't care if they share my blood. I don't care if they sign my trust fund. From this moment, the full weight of every resource I control is pointed at anyone who touches them. And Mother, I will dismantle this family's legacy brick by brick before I let you hurt them again. This is the moment Julian Prescott stops being a bystander in his own life. For 6 years, his mother controlled the narrative. And now, standing in his mother's study, he does something that is far more difficult than writing a check or filing a lawsuit. He draws a line. He tells his own mother that she is his enemy. He walked out. Victoria sat very still for a long time. The Financial Times lay open to an article about hostile takeovers, which under the circumstances felt uncomfortably appropriate. Julian moved Hadley and Lily to a cottage in Westchester, small, warm, with a garden and a security system that could have protected a minor embassy. He filed a countersuit that froze the custody action. He hired a legal team that made Blair's attorneys reconsider their career choices. And then he waited because he understood finally that he couldn't buy back what he'd lost. He could only show up day after day and prove that the man Hadley had loved 6 years ago still existed somewhere beneath the armor of wealth and bitterness. But Blair Kensington was not finished. She had one final move. The gala at the Kensington estate in Rhode Island was Blair's last gambit. Arthur Kensington, failing in health and eager to secure his legacy, had announced a formal ceremony to name his sole heir. Blair had orchestrated it as a coronation, her coronation, with 500 witnesses, a press pool, and a document that would make her control of the Kensington fortune legally unassailable. She sent Hadley an anonymous letter. Appear at the gala to sign a permanent renunciation of any claim to the Kensington name, or watch fabricated footage of Lily surface on every tabloid in America. Hadley read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she folded it, placed it in the wooden box on the bathroom shelf, the box that had once held ribbons, and walked to the closet. She owned one evening gown. She bought it at a consignment shop 3 years ago for a job interview. She never attended because Lily got sick. It was simple, black floor length, no label, no jewelry, no camouflage. She called Julian. I'm going to Rhode Island. I know, I'll drive. Julian, she hesitated. Lily's ribbon. I'm not putting it on tonight. A pause, then good. That exchange, 6 words from Hadley, 1 word from Julian, and an entire philosophy of defiance compressed into the decision not to tie a ribbon around a child's throat. For 6 years, the ribbon was protection. Now it becomes a declaration. Hadley is done hiding. They arrived at the Kensington estate, a stone monument to inherited power. Perched on the Newport cliffs like a castle that had forgotten it wasn't medieval. With Lily between them, her small hand in each of theirs, the birthmark on her throat visible and uncovered for the first time in public. They walked the red carpet in silence, and the silence was louder than anything. The ballroom was Renaissance in scale and intention. Vaulted ceilings painted with clouds, crystal chandeliers that had survived the Gilded Age, and enough marble to build a Roman bath. 500 guests turned as one when the doors opened. Blair stood at the podium, radiant in white, diamonds cascading from her throat to her collarbone. A collar, Julian realized now, designed to cover the absence where a birthmark should have been. She held a microphone and a smile, and both were weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with tonight's ceremony, I want to acknowledge some unexpected guests. This is Hadley Sutton, an old acquaintance of Julian's. It breaks my heart to see a young mother resort to such desperate measures, using an innocent child to manufacture a claim on our family's legacy. Hadley stood motionless, her jaw tightened. A bead of blood appeared on her lower lip, where her teeth had pressed too hard, but she did not speak. She did not cry. She held Lily against her hip, and her silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone who has survived worse than words. Julian stepped forward. His hand found Hadley's and closed around it. He opened his mouth, but it was not Julian who stopped Blair. It was the sharp crack of a gold-handled cane against marble. Arthur Kensington rose from his chair with the deliberate authority of a man who had been watching and waiting and understanding for longer than anyone in the room suspected. He walked toward Lily. His steps were slow but certain. The crowd parted for him the way crowds always do for people who have earned the right to take up space. He stopped in front of the girl. He lowered himself, one hand on the cane, one hand on his knee, until his face was level with hers. His gaze found the birthmark on her throat, and his entire body went still. The stillness of recognition of a prayer being answered decades after it was spoken. His hand rose, trembling, and hovered a centimeter from the mark without touching it, as though it were sacred. "The crescent and the star," he whispered. His voice carried in the silence. "Eleanor's mark. My Margaret's mark. No hand on earth can forge what God inscribes in blood." Arthur Kensington is 91 years old. He has buried his wife. He has buried his son. He believed he had one grandchild left, Blair, and he built his entire end-of-life legacy around her. And now in a ballroom full of 500 witnesses, he is kneeling in front of a 6-year-old girl in a consignment shop dress. And he is recognizing the mark that connects 5 generations of his bloodline. Blair's voice cut through shrill now, stripped of its performance. "Grandfather, stop. It's a fake. She painted it on the child. It's a—" "Enough." The word fell like a gavel. Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Julian's attorney entered, flanked by a geneticist from the Swiss Federal Institute, whose testimony had over the past 3 weeks been verified by 2 independent laboratories. The attorney carried a sealed forensic dossier. Julian released Hadley's hand and stepped forward. His voice was cold and precise, and it filled every corner of that enormous room. 3 weeks ago, while Blair was busy orchestrating this parade, I submitted DNA samples, Hadley's, Blair's, and Arthur's, to 3 independent laboratories in Zurich. The results have been certified by the Federal Forensic Institute. The attorney broke the seal. He read clearly, his voice trained for courtrooms and accustomed to the weight of words that end careers and begin prison sentences. Genetic analysis confirms 0% consanguinity between Arthur Kensington and Blair Kensington. Genetic analysis confirms 99.9% consanguinity between Arthur Kensington and Hadley Sutton. Blair Kensington is not a biological member of the Kensington family. Hadley Sutton is the sole surviving direct blood heir. The room erupted not in noise but in movement. The unconscious choreography of 500 people recalibrating their loyalties in real time. Watch the crowd. Seconds ago, they were looking at Hadley with pity or contempt. Now they're recalculating. That's the ugly mathematics of high society. Your value is determined by your proximity to power. And in the span of one sentence, the power just shifted. Julian reached into his jacket and produced a small recording device. And this, he said, is a digitally recovered conversation between Blair's mother, Irene Walsh, and Blair herself, recorded on a personal phone and authenticated by forensic audio analysts. It details the infant swap performed 26 years ago and the coercion of Hadley Sutton 6 years ago, including the threat to remove Margaret Chen from the transplant list unless Hadley took the money and disappeared. He pressed play. Blair's legs gave out. She crumpled. Not dramatically. She simply folded. The way structures fail when the load-bearing wall is removed. Her knees hit the marble. The diamond necklace caught the chandelier light one last time before she buried her face in her hands. Nobody helped her up. Arthur Kensington turned from the wreckage of his fraudulent granddaughter and looked at Hadley. His eyes, which had been steel for 91 years, were bright with tears. He opened his arms. Hadley didn't move. She stood rigid, holding Lily, her breath shallow and fast because the world had just inverted itself, and she didn't yet trust the new gravity. Then Lily reached out, one small hand, fingers splayed, toward the old man she'd never met, but somehow recognized the way blood recognizes blood across any distance. "Are you my grandpa?" Lily asked. Arthur's composure shattered. A sound escaped him. Not a word, just a raw syllable of grief and joy compressed into a single breath. "Yes, my darling. I am, and I have been looking for you your whole life." Hadley's shoulders dropped. She stepped forward. Arthur's arms closed around them both, and he held on with the desperate strength of a man who understood exactly how much time he'd lost and how little he had left. Victoria Prescott watched from her table. Her face was the color of ash. The woman she'd paid $2 million to destroy was the granddaughter of the one man whose social standing exceeded her own. The irony was exquisite and merciless. And here is the final twist of the knife for Victoria Prescott. She didn't just pay off a nobody. She paid off American royalty. The woman she dismissed as a gold digger, the orphan she threatened and exiled, is the direct blood heir to a fortune and a legacy that dwarfs her own. Every dollar Victoria spent, every lie she told, every string she pulled, all of it was aimed at a woman who by birthright outranks her. The universe has a sense of humor. It's just not a kind one. 1 year later, the beach was private, belonging to the Kensington estate on Martha's Vineyard, and at this hour, late afternoon, the sun hanging low and orange over the Atlantic. It was empty except for the three of them. Lily ran ahead, chasing ghost crabs across the wet sand, her laughter carried by the wind. The birthmark on her throat was uncovered, catching the last light. She'd stopped asking for the ribbon months ago. Hadley sat on the sand, barefoot, watching her daughter run. She wore a linen dress that cost nothing special and fit perfectly. Beside her, a pair of sandals behind her footsteps. Julian settled next to her. He'd lost the Tom Ford suits for the weekend, just a white linen shirt, sleeves rolled, no watch, no phone. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. And she leaned back into him, and neither of them spoke for a while because they had learned over the past year that the most important conversations don't require words. He reached into his pocket and placed something in her open palm. Not a ring, not yet. The ring would come later on a Tuesday with no audience, no cameras, no fanfare, just the two of them and Lily at the kitchen table because Hadley had made him promise that when it happened it would be ordinary. What he placed in her hand was a set of brass keys, old and heavy, green with patina. "What are these?" she asked. "The keys to your old apartment in the building. I bought the whole block." She turned to look at him. "Julian, I'm not demolishing it. I'm not developing it. It's staying exactly as it is." He pressed his lips to her temple. "Because that building is where you were the strongest version of yourself when I wasn't there to see it. And it will stand there for the rest of our lives, reminding me that I never get to let go of your hand again." Hadley looked at the keys. She closed her fingers around them. A single tear fell onto the brass, darkening the patina. She turned, took his face in both hands, and kissed him. Slowly, deliberately, the way you seal a promise you intend to keep while the sun bled into the ocean, and Lily's laughter spiraled up from the shoreline like something released finally into open air. And so the girl who once hid her birthmark behind a 60-cent ribbon became the woman who wore it like a crown. Hadley Sutton didn't inherit the Kensington name. She reclaimed it, not with money, not with power, but with the one thing no amount of wealth can manufacture and no amount of cruelty can destroy: the simple, stubborn, unreasonable refusal to let the world break her. Some legacies are written in wills. Others are written in scars, in sacrifice, in the quiet courage of a mother who chose love over money and ended up deserving both, in the fingerprints on a crayon drawing of a chandelier building, in the melody of an old lullaby sung by a 6-year-old girl who didn't know she was singing her family back together. If this story moved you, if you felt something shift inside your chest, that's not an accident. That's the part of you that still believes people can change, that love can survive the worst of what money and power throw at it, and that sometimes the most important inheritance isn't the fortune, it's the birthmark. Thank you for staying until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next story. We bring you a new emotional story every single day because everyone deserves a story that makes them believe in love again. See you in the next.